I'm on. Okay, good morning. Welcome to our Sunday morning Bible class at the Ballin Park Church of Christ. September the 20th. It's a beautiful Lord's Day. I think we all made it through the storm in spite of the rain. We had buckets full of rain coming down, but the Lord was watching over us, and as always. I want to thank everyone for the last couple of weeks. We have received, I think my number says $650 that we received for our support for the two children we have at the City of Children in Ensenada, Mexico. I want to thank our class for that. Last week we looked at Samuel as one of the prophets, and he was actually the third, depending on the count, maybe fourth prophet since Moses, after Moses died. And Samuel was not only the last of the judges, he was also a priest, being from the tribe of Levi. He was also a prophet. God spoke with him, and he spoke to God's people. That was his message or his mission. He was also the kingmaker. He anointed both Saul and David to be king, and it was also a transition. Samuel was a transition. We talked about this last week, between the period of Judges, when Israel was a group of disunited tribes. They did not work together very well. In fact, there was a couple of conflicts between the tribes. Maybe we would think they were trivial, but to them they were very important. But there's a lot of idolatry going on, a lot of different things happening in that Judges period. But Samuel was a transition from that disorganized nation, a group of tribes, we should say, to a united nation, and he brought Israel back to God. Under Moses and Joshua, Israel was very, very faithful. They were very, very fervent in their religious practice. But after Joshua died, and those who were elders of the people when Joshua was living, when they had died, the people began to get away from serving God, from worshiping God. And that demonstrates the importance of good spiritual leaders in the nation. But during that time period, things were rough. And Samuel brought Israel back to God and convinced them that serving and worshiping God was the way to go, and God would bless them. But then Israel asked for a king. They wanted a king who would lead them into battle, and that really bothered Samuel, although Samuel had only led them in one battle, and they had become victorious because of the help of God, as you go back and read especially the story about Ebenezer. But it disturbed Samuel that they wanted a king because, as God says to Samuel, they have rejected him as their king. And so we know the story how he anointed Saul, and then later, because of other issues, he anointed David to be king. And during the time that Saul was king, while Saul was chasing David around, you know the stories there, Samuel dies about age 80. In 1 Samuel chapter 25 and verse 1, in the midst of the story of Saul chasing after David, trying to kill David, it just points out that Samuel died. Just all of a sudden, just out of the blue, nothing is said he was sick or anything. He died. He was probably 80 years old, give or take. And all Israel gathered together and mourned for him. So there was a peace at the ceremony, at the funeral between Saul and David during this time period. And they buried him at his home in Ramah, and David arose and went down to the wilderness of Paran. Now, after that, Saul reigned for about 40 years, or during that time, and then David took his place, and he reigned for about 40 years, and that's in 2 Samuel. And then after David died, before we get into that, Saul was a warrior king. He was not an organizer. He was not a statesman. He was not a politician. He was a general rather than a king. He never established any kind of an organization in the government. He had his son Jonathan and some other guys working as captains in the army, but the army was not really organized as we would think an army should be organized. And Saul never had really a capital. He never had a palace, although the word, his home, is used as that position. But he really didn't do much as far as keeping Israel united as a nation, as Samuel had done. Now, when David became king, he too was a warrior king. In fact, he finished up the work that Samson should have done, that Saul should have done in defeating and conquering and controlling the Philistines. In fact, some of the Philistine warriors were made bodyguards for David. And if you go through and read Chronicles, you'll find he mentions the Cherethites. Those were the descendants of the Philistines that were bodyguards in David's army. David was an organizer. As he planned for the temple, he separated out the Levites by their families and organized a system where they would come and everybody would be there for the Passover and serve for a couple of weeks around the Passover, and then they'd all go home, and this family would serve 1 week, and then another family, a priest would come and serve the second week, and so forth. And in fact, Zechariah in Luke chapter 1 served the 8th week after Passover. That's when his family would have been there. So he would have been there like the week after the Pentecost, or right in that time frame. So David organized that. He organized the army. He had captains of hundreds and fifties and so forth. David was also a statesman. He was the politician. He worked to unite Israel together, but not just as a nation politically, but as a nation religiously. David led them to worship. He brought them back to God. And if you read the Psalms that David wrote, and he wrote about half of the book of Psalms, about 72 is all we can literally give him credit for of the 150 Psalms. But David was a religious man, the man after God's own heart. And he brought Israel back into that relationship with God, and that excited a great deal of religious fervor. Now, if we had kind of a chart, we could see from Moses there was a very good high religious fervor, and then Joshua, then it began to vacillate and go down and down during the period of Judges, and back up during the time of David, and even higher during the time of Solomon. Now, it's going to descend after that, and we don't have a chart to show that, but that's going to happen later on. David was also established Jerusalem as his capital. Jerusalem was not perfectly centrally located in the nation, kind of like Montgomery is not perfectly centered of Alabama. Jerusalem was not perfectly centered in Palestine, but yet it was probably one of the highest points in the country. It was very well defended and very well defendable, very difficult to attack. And so David chose that walled city of the Jebusites. In fact, it was called Salem before. And it belonged to the Jebusites, and so it was the Jebus Salem. And if you make one little adjustment to the letter, you've got Jerusalem. And that was the city of Melchizedek in Genesis chapter 14. So it was a very prominent city throughout Israel's history, but David makes it his capital and organizes it and sets it up in a very fine way to be the center not only of the politics of Israel, but also of the religion. Israel was a theocracy. God was king, and David saw that everybody understood that. And their political realm is really the same as their spiritual realm. The law of Moses was not only their religious law, it was their constitutional law. Everything they did was based on the law of Moses. There wasn't a separation of church and state. It was all church. That's how they viewed it, and that's how God had designed it in the beginning. Of course, it varied away from that as time went on. Well, after David, Solomon became king. And we know the story of Solomon, how he went to Shechem. Now, and remember, Shechem was where Jacob's well was. And Shechem was at the foot of Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal. Mount Ebal, Mount Gerizim form a horseshoe ridge. Ebal is the northernmost point, and Gerizim is the southernmost point. And in that horseshoe ridge, Joshua organized all of Israel, and they stood up on the mountainside. They read the law to them. They built an altar down there, wrote the law on the altar. Everybody said amen to the blessings and curses of the law. And it's a very religious point for Joshua and Israel. And that's where Solomon went and was crowned or had his coronation ceremony at Shechem, more central in the country. And it kind of brought all Israel together under him. And we remember the story how Solomon was asked by God, what do you want? And Solomon said, I want wisdom. So God gave him everything else. But Solomon had a very peaceful reign, partly because of God's blessing, but partly because of David's conquering. He conquered all the land of Canaan and Palestine and other nations around and had them paying tribute and taxes to Israel. And that benefited Solomon greatly. Solomon, we know, we give him credit for building the temple. He also built a palace, several palaces. He built the house of the forest of Lebanon, a tribute to Hiram, the king of Tyre, for the cedars that he sent down for the building of the temple and other Solomon's other works. He also established a chariot system. He had a bunch of chariots in his army. He had ships, a navy that was kind of run by the Phoenicians. But Solomon, because of his wives, went into idolatry. And we know we say Solomon had 1,000 wives. He actually had 300 wives, and 700 concubines. Or like a child in Sunday school said, he had 300 wives and 700 cucumber vines. So kind of misunderstood the word there. But you wonder about Solomon's wisdom. You realize he had 300 mothers-in-law? Just think about the importance of that issue and how carefully he had to tread. But we say, well, why did he have all those? Understand that most of these girls were bride presents. I'll say that again. A bride presents. The kings of other nations would send their daughter to Solomon to be his wife as a bribe to keep Solomon from attacking them. And so in the spring, when kings would go out to war, Solomon said, well, let's go have a war. Who are we going to fight? How about this country here? And I say, oh, no, the king's daughter is one of your wives. They're your in-laws, so you can't attack them. And so that kind of shuts down that. And that lent a great deal of peace to all of Israel during Solomon's reign. But because of his wives and their wanting to maintain their idolatrous practices, Solomon actually built temples for their idolatrous gods. And so Solomon went into idolatry, and because of that, God decided to divide the kingdom. Now, that wasn't the only thing. The division of the kingdom happened or began with Jacob when he blessed his 12 sons back in Genesis, 48. But the kingdom was divided, and there were a number of factors that came into this division process. It wasn't just one thing, but remember when Solomon died, Rehoboam became king, and he went to Shechem to be crowned, and the people came and said, can you lighten up the tax burden? And Rehoboam took the wrong advice and said, no, we're going to increase the tax burden. And 10 tribes said, to your tents of Israel, we've got nothing to do with the house of Judah. And so we have said over the years that there were 10 tribes that became the northern kingdom of Israel, and 2 tribes became the southern kingdom of Judah. That's not exactly accurate, because it wasn't that they said, okay, we split, and they hired a survey crew, and they drew the Mason-Dixon line between north and south and said there's no crossing over. There was a period of time of migration. People in the north did not like Jeroboam, and so they moved to the south, to Judah. Most of the Levites moved to the south, to Judah. Not that they were loyal so much to Solomon and Rehoboam, they were more loyal to God and to the temple. And Jeroboam took other men and made them priests for his idols, and so that kind of put the Levites out, so they all moved. The tribe of Simeon, which was originally granted land down below Judah, had by this time kind of ceased to exist. They had assimilated into Judah. But there were people from all 12 tribes, actually all 13 tribes, in Israel, as well as in Judah. And so it wasn't an even split or definite split, and only these people lived here and so forth. There was kind of a big mixture. But Israel became the name of the northern 10 tribes, so to speak, and Judah the name of the southern kingdom. Both kingdoms went into idolatry. Now, the southern kingdom of Judah was in and out. That's kind of a misstatement here on the screen. But Israel was totally given to idolatry. And once Jeroboam started it, they went downhill, and they went downhill quick. But during this time period, there were many prophets besides Samuel. During the time of David, there was Iddo the seer, and Gad, and Nathan the prophet. Remember, Nathan is the one who condemned David for his sin with Bathsheba. And there were others that had names, but there are a lot of them that had no names. Or at least their names were not given. It's just a man of God came and delivered a message. And they're scattered throughout the time of Saul and David and Solomon and Rehoboam and throughout the divided kingdom. These men were from the schools of the prophets that Samuel had started. And they were perhaps teachers in the schools. They were called the sons of the prophets. Now that's important because we're going to study one of the prophets who said, I'm not a prophet. I'm not a son of a prophet. That means he didn't go to prophet school. That's basically the point. But the schools of the prophets were very active, and apparently these schools were led by either these prophets or by the priesthood as well. And so this was all going on in the background behind the scenes. But Israel, the northern kingdom, went deep into Baal worship. And again, Baal takes several different forms, and there are several different images of Baal or kinds of Baal. The Philistines worship Beelzebub, the god of the fly. That means if you keep this Baal happy, then you will not have flies at your picnic. That's how they viewed it. Now we think, well, that's ridiculous, and I wonder whatever happened to the god of the ants, because they're everywhere. I don't know what we're not doing to keep him happy. But that was their idea. That's how they viewed their religion. Incorrect and superstitious, but that's how they viewed it. But they went deep into idolatry, mostly led by Omri, who was Ahab's father, then Ahab and Jezebel. Ahab was the son of Omri, and he was about the 6th or 7th king in the line. I've forgotten the exact number. But Omri had got Jezebel brought in to be the wife of Ahab. She was from Sidon, and she brought with her Baal worship, and she insisted that she was going to eliminate the worship of God in order to institute the worship of Baal. She worked to kill all of the prophets of God, and many of them she did, but there were some of them that were reserved, as we'll see. And in all of this idolatry, in all of this scenery of wickedness going on in the northern kingdom of Israel, in 1 Kings chapter 17, we read this. Now Elijah the Tishbite, who was of the settlers of Gilead, said to Ahab, the Lord God said, there's not going to be any rain until I say so. I mean, out of nowhere, Elijah just pops up. There's nothing said about there's a prophet coming. There's no indication that there's going to be a prophet. He just shows up. Just come out of the blue and said, it's not going to rain for 3 years until I say so. Now, with Elisha, there are a number of miracles that are involved, and we'll get into those maybe in a minute. But Elijah is described later on in 2 Kings chapter 1 as a hairy man who wore a leather girdle. And you say, okay, what's the significance of that? We'll see here. Elijah was, there's several miracles associated with Elijah. He said it wouldn't rain, and then 3 years later it did rain at his request. The fire from God on the prophets, or on the sacrifice at Mount Carmel, the contest with the prophets of Baal. There are several miraculous supply. He was fed by the ravens. You remember that story from Sunday school. He stayed with the widow of Zarephath for a while, and the list goes on and on. But the fire from heaven we associate with Elijah. We call him sometimes the fiery prophet because of that. But Elisha also stands as a representative of all of the prophets. So when you read, especially in the New Testament, Moses and the prophets, or they'll say Moses and Elijah. Not just Moses, the man, but the writings of Moses, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, specifically the law. And Elijah stands as the single representative of all the prophets of the Old Testament. And he was an odd one. He didn't dress like the rest of us. He didn't live like the rest of us. He was the odd man. But he's also the one who's referred to more in the New Testament than any other of the Old Testament prophets. Not that he was quoted like Isaiah and the Psalms and others, but he's mentioned by name. If he shows up at the Mount of Transfiguration in Matthew 17 with Moses talking with Jesus, you remember the story there. Peter, James, and John were there watching and saw Jesus transfigured. And he was talking with Moses, who represented the law, and Elijah, who represented all the prophets. He's also a type of John the Baptist. Now, the study of type and antitype is confusing for some folks, but I'll kind of explain it right quick. Elijah showed up out of nowhere, dressed different than the rest of us, and began preaching God's word. You read Matthew chapter 3, Mark chapter 1, Luke chapter 3, John chapter 1. In the wilderness of Judea, up pops this guy out of nowhere, John the Baptist, preaching a baptism of repentance for the remission of sins. And suddenly, out of nowhere, with no evidence or precursor or warning, this prophet, this John, pops up. John didn't dress like everybody else. He dressed different. He worked different. He was different. And that raised people's attention to John as he came preparing the country for the coming of Jesus. In Malachi chapter 4, beginning in verses 4, 5, and 6, the very last three verses of the Old Testament. As Malachi, who wrote 400 years before Jesus and John were born, as Malachi was laying down the pen of Old Testament inspiration, he wrote these words, "Remember the law of Moses, my servant, even the statutes and ordinances which I commanded him in Horeb for all of Israel. Behold, I'm going to send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and terrible day of the Lord, and he will restore the hearts of the fathers to their children, the hearts of the children of their fathers, lest I come and smite the land with a curse. Now, if you go to Luke chapter 1, the angel told Zacharias that day in the temple that he and Elizabeth were going to have a son. Name him John. And the angel says that, let me back up to where the angel said it. Verse 17 of Luke 1, it is he who will go as a forerunner before him, that's Jesus, in the spirit and power of Elijah, to turn the hearts of the fathers back to the children, and the disobedient back to the attitude of the righteous, to make ready a people prepared for the Lord. And then when John was born and Zacharias wrote his name down on the tablet and his tongue was loosed, we know that story, that he began to talk about John. And in verse 76, he says of Luke chapter 1, you, child, will be called the prophet of the Most High. You will go on before the Lord to prepare his ways, to give to his people the knowledge of salvation by the forgiveness of their sins. John was going to be the power or the spirit of Elijah renewed. And when they came to him and said, are you that Elijah? He said, no. Really, he was. And the disciples didn't understand, so they asked of Jesus, well, before the Messiah comes, Elijah's supposed to come. And he said he did come. He was John. He didn't say those words, but they understood that's what Jesus was talking about. Now, after the event in 1 Kings chapter 18, when Moses had all the prophets of Baal at Mount Carmel, they had a big contest, and the prophets of Baal were killed. Jezebel said, I'm going to kill Elijah. And so Elijah got scared, and he ran for his life. And he ran down to Beersheba. Now, when you get to Beersheba, you're as far in Palestine as you can go without leaving the country. I mean, you take a step out of Beersheba, and there's a sign that said, this is your last chance to buy gas. Next rest area, 500 miles. Because there was no place after that. You just jumped out of the land of Israel and Judah. God met him there and said, you go on. And he went down to Mount Horeb, and you can read the story there. And God says, Elijah, what are you down here for? He said, I'm the only one. I'm the last of them. Nobody worships God but me, and Jezebel's trying to kill me. Elijah went down and had a pity party. That's all we can say. He was down there worried about his life because of what he had done for God. But God says, here's what I want you to do. I want you to go back. Go back to Israel. And when you go back, I want you to anoint Hazael, the king of Aram or Syria, anoint Jehu to be the king of Israel, and then anoint Elisha to be the prophet in your place. In other words, I've already picked your replacement, but you go on back. And then God says, by the way, I've got 7,000 people in Israel who have not bowed the knee to Baal. In other words, Elijah, you are not the Lone Ranger. And how often we feel like we're the only one. How often do we feel like nobody's doing anything but me? There are 7,000 people in Israel, Elijah, who have not worshiped Baal. Don't worry about it. You're not by yourself. You may be the one in the public eye, but you're not by yourself. And there's a lesson here for you and for me. You're not the Lone Ranger. During the last few months of this COVID experience, we've had a lot of people who have lost fathers or mothers to death, brothers and sisters. They found out they're diagnosed with cancer. They found out their family members are hurting. They've had surgery. We can't go visit them in the hospital. They're missing that touch, that sympathy, that condolence, that companionship, that fellowship of suffering. And so we feel like I'm the Lone Ranger. No matter what your suffering or what your trouble or what your problem, you are not alone. Others have gone through it. And if you will get off of your pride horse, if you get off of your own self-pity, realize someone else has been through that. And they can help you through it, regardless of what your suffering might be. Don't feel like you are alone. My father passed away 14 years ago. Your father passed away recently. I've been through what you're going through. I'd like to help you. My sister died 11 years ago. You lost your sister. I know what it's like. I understand. And I'm not the only one. There are others in this church who would love to assist you and help you work through whatever issue it is you might have. Well, mine's not that big. If it's a problem and you need help with it, it's big enough. Don't be afraid to ask for help. There's someone who would love to be an assistant to you and serve you. So don't be like Elijah. Sit down there in this pity party, get up, get at it, get some help, like Elijah did. Elijah anointed Elisha to be his replacement. Now, he did not go to Hazael or Jehu like God said, but he had Elisha do that later, we'll see. But Elisha, and you go to 2 Kings chapter 2, as Elisha was collected or anointed by Elijah to be his replacement, they kind of worked together. I think they worked in the schools of prophets. My opinion is, it's just my opinion, that Elisha was a member of that school of the prophets, or the schools of the prophets. And but Elisha was given by Elijah his apprenticeship. And then in 2 Kings chapter 2, it came about when the Lord was about to take Elijah by a whirlwind to heaven. Now, I want you to read that very carefully. God was going to take Elijah to heaven by a whirlwind, not a chariot. I said that one day and said, well, all the pictures that we look at in our Sunday school books come from artists' conceptions. Elisha did not have a Polaroid that day. He forgot and left his camera at home, and his iPhone wasn't working. He didn't have any signal, so he couldn't take a picture. So the pictures we have weren't taken by Elisha. Elijah went to heaven in a whirlwind. But and with Elijah, there are several miracles associated. So Elisha went with Elijah, and when this event happened, they saw the chariot of fire and horses of fire coming down the road, and there are several things that transpired in all of this. They went through a couple of schools of the prophets before they got there. And you know, if you and I are walking down the sidewalk, and we look up and we see a kid coming in on a skateboard or a bicycle, there are several things that might go through our mind. What's this kid doing in the middle of the sidewalk on a skateboard? Can he read the sign, no bikes on the sidewalk? Doesn't he understand how dangerous that is? All those things might go through our minds. We might think, well, where are his parents? If you watch carefully on the skateboard behind him, no, we wonder about that. But when we see the kid coming, we have a choice to make. Stand still and get run over, or get out of the way. And so I go to this side, and you go to that side, and we let the kid pass through. Elijah and Elisha walking down the road, you keep reading through here, and in verse 11, there's a chariot of fire and horses of fire that came down the road and separated them. Elijah took one ditch, Elisha took the other. And verse 12 says, or verse 11 says, and Elijah went up by a whirlwind to heaven. But when he went, his mantle, his outer garment fell off. And Elisha picked it up, and that was his request. Let me have a double portion of your spirit. Let me have what you've got times 2, so I can be the prophet that I need to be and take your place. And so Elijah promised, if I drop my mantle, you got your wish. Well, he did, and thus it was. And so Elisha went back, and he performed several miracles like Elijah had done. There's a resurrection involved, several miracles of supply. The one I like is he made the axe head to float. And there were some others that are associated with Elisha, some 16 or 17 in all that he did. He didn't have the fire that Elijah did. He was different. Elijah didn't dress like us. Elisha was more one of us. He dressed like us. He worked like us. He lived like us. He lived among us. He was not a hermit like Elijah, who went and lived by the brook or came out of nowhere. We knew where Elisha came from. He was in the local papers. We've got a copy of his birth certificate. Elijah, we don't know anything about. Elisha, we did. So they were very different in their work. Elisha did go, and he anointed Hazael to be the king of Syria. And that brought a judgment upon Israel. That was God's plan, to use Syria or Aram to be judgment upon Israel for their idolatry. He also sent one of the sons of the prophets, to Jehu, to anoint him as king over Israel. That's after Ahab died, and a little bit later, Jehu comes in. He basically wipes out the house of Ahab at God's design, at God's request, as judgment and punishment on the house of Ahab. But Elisha also worked with the schools of the prophets. Several of his miracles associated with the schools of the prophets. But here's the point. Wrong direction. Here we go. Elijah and Elisha worked to check the rampant idolatry in the northern kingdom of Israel. They, as prophets of God, worked to stop or to at least slow down a very dangerous problem in Israel. In the long run, they failed, but in the immediate, they served their purpose. They presented God's message to God's people to try to prevent them from going worse into idolatry. The sons of the prophets during this period were very active as they helped Elijah and Elisha to bring about this mission of letting Israel know God's plan was for them not to worship idolatry. But also, their work, the work of Elijah and Elisha, is interwoven in the history of Israel. As you go back and you read, beginning in 1 Kings chapter 17 through 2 Kings when Elisha dies, they're kind of prominent at times and they kind of disappear from review at times. But their work in the background is interwoven in the history of Israel. As they lay groundwork for the prophets to follow them, as they preach to the people. In fact, they're contemporary with some of the writing prophets. The lessons for us: our work in the church is interwoven in the history of this church. Ever thought about that? Our work is interwoven in the fabric of the lives of those to whom we minister. The work that we do as Christians, we're like Elijah, we're like Elisha. We may need to be bold and be different like Elijah was. We may need to be a little more calm like Elisha was. We need some of both. We need the schools of the prophets working among us, interweaving with us into the fabric of the life of the church and those to whom we serve and we minister. Because we cannot tell today the effects of our work later on. It's like dropping a stone into a pond. Where do the ripples go? We can see them go so far, but how far do they really go? The sacrifices that our ancestors made brought us to this point. The sacrifices, the work that we do today, pave the way for those to follow us. We're building bridges for children and grandchildren to cross. We're working to bring about God's word, not just now, but in the future. So understand our work that we're doing in the church is not in vain. Be faithful unto death, Jesus said. Be not weary in well-doing, we shall reap. We may not see the harvest ourselves, but God will. And at the judgment day, Jesus will say, "Come, you're blessed because you did." And we'll wonder when. How did we affect that? Our work is interwoven in the history of this church and the lives of those to whom we minister. As we work together living for Him, as we work together speaking for Him, as we work together serving in His name to bring about the glory of the work of the church. Next week, we want to look at Hosea. Hosea is kind of an odd one in a lot of ways because he was called by God to marry the wrong woman. Thank you. God bless you. Have a great week.